Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
Well, Rachael, I'm going to just start by saying I'm not particularly thrilled to talk about what we're going to talk about, and that is post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder and the reality of living in an ongoing pandemic and a complicated world, including levels of grief with ongoing racial trauma, ongoing political demonization and divide, and just the wicked heartbreak of Ukraine. And so we're going to talk about trauma, which is, it's our work. But I'm like, you need to help me today. This is a bit like that one podcast we did where we both had to acknowledge we are not doing well. Yeah. And especially as we focus something of this labor today on being help to people who, like us, are considered to be leaders or helpers, whether you're a parent, whether you're a friend, whether or not you are in some position of authority to care for others. Nonetheless, we all are in an ongoing post-traumatic stress, and we are all so wickedly tired of talking about this. So that's where I'm beginning.
Yeah, I hear your words, and there is something I felt even in my body, like when we talked about needing to step into some of these waters. You know, I just want to name, for those of you listening, we come to this too with that sense of like, it's so pervasive right now. It's almost overwhelming. And I think especially for the helpers, right? Like the people who are in positions, pastoral leadership, like you just named, therapists, medical professionals, teachers, where you really haven't gotten to stop. Like there's been an ongoing tending to the people in your midst while you're also tending to your own. And it can feel completely and utterly overwhelming and almost like, you know what, it's fine. Let's just keep surviving. And that's not to say there's not moments of reprieve and rest and restoration and joy and all of the parts of being human. But I'm just kind of going like, what I'm taking with me today into this is two things. We just talked about this in the Easter podcast last week, but that sense of like, it's when we're in the midst of complex trauma that's pretty pervasive, it can feel like there's just such futility and nothing lasts. And any gains you make in health or, you know, attempting to push back the burnout that's coming, it just feels like it's so easy for it to be depleted. And just that sense of like our labor because of the resurrection is not in vain. So even the smallest things remain, they matter, they have impact, they change neural pathways, and we'll get into that. And I just think we have to step into this with a sense of we're going to be talking about trying to put some language to what is post-traumatic stress, disorder, what is post-traumatic stress, how does that kind of trauma impact us? We're going to put some language to that. We're going to have a follow-up conversation around, what do we do? How do we move toward any kind of healing or hope when that is our reality? So I just want to state from the beginning, God is with us, and our labor is not in vain, and we are not left to our own human devices. So this is just a place where I need to know something of the Spirit of God is with us, providing gifts of grace that exceed our human capacity. They don't deny our humanity or spiritually bypass our humanity. But we do not labor in vain, and we do not labor alone and on our own limitations.
And to that end, I'm just going to ask for the privilege to, at least for my own heart, to acknowledge the presence of Jesus. And so Jesus, for those of our listeners that are too weary to even bear more conversation, be their blessing. Be the blessing of knowing when to listen to this. Indeed, Jesus, give us discernment. even in the conversation, I'm asking for hope. I'm asking for a restoration. In my own traumatized body, I ask for the presence of your resurrected body. And we pray that for each person listening as well. We pray that in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, jumping into what some of our listeners have heard, let me say it again. There are three huge components to all forms of post-traumatic stress. And that happens to be that all trauma brings fragmentation. And it isn't just, I'm not thinking well. It is that our brain was never meant to hold the complexity of trauma. And so the fact that certain parts of our brain go off and certain brain portions come lighted on. So what goes off, just quickly, our left frontal lobe, particularly Broca's area, where we manage language, thought, logic, linearity, deduction, will, and choice, essentially goes offline. So that's one of the realities with regard to the effect on memory. When we go through an event that bears significant traumatization, we will not remember it with a kind of A to B to C to D, because our brain isn't working as it normally would to be able to code, to be able to store, and be able to retrieve memory as we normally might. But as well, portions of our brain like the thalamus, which integrates so much of our visceral, somatic body experience and meaning, that is language, essentially goes offline. So we're really at a deficit in the middle of trauma. But the portion of our brain in the limbic system called the amygdala, which produces a great deal of our stress biochemicals like cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, catecholamines, it's a pumping. It's a moving in our body so that we are, on an evolutionary basis, able to fight or flee or make, in some sense, the inchoate decision to really freeze. So what we're saying is fragmentation is inevitable in terms of almost all forms of trauma. And before we go a whole lot further, what I find is that a lot of people go, yeah, I get it. But, what I've been finding for myself and for a lot of others is I would call fragmentation in the normal sense of just the day-to-day sense of up and down, like a kind of graying of our world or fogging of our world. It isn't just we're fragmented, can't think. It's that I am forgetting so many elemental things. Like Becky asked me just today, do you remember when so-and-so visited? And I'm like, no, when? And when she began talking about the event, I'm going, I have zero memory of the event, which wasn't that terribly long ago. So let's just spend a moment talking about the haze and fog that grays out our experience of life.
Yeah. Well, and even just to name part of why we're talking about this now and why we've talked about it at different iterations of the past few years is we've been in this a long while now. And that fogginess, like when you think about being in fog, you can't see in any direction. You can't see behind you. You can't see what's around you. It's hard to locate yourself in context. I also think about like when I think about fogginess, I think of the incapacity to locate myself in time. I mean, how many moments, it's like, oh wait, that was 2 years ago. It feels like it was yesterday, but no, that was 2 years ago. And what did we even do? Michael and I were trying to remember what we did last Easter. Couldn't remember. We totally went to Washington, D.C. to see the cherry blossoms. That does not feel like it was a year ago. It feels like it was 3 years ago. So that sense of timelessness and not being able to locate things. I mean, I think we've joked about this on here before, but even just trying to talk and how many moments I've been like, wait, what's that word? The thing, the door that shuts, that keeps your pantry. cabinet, the cabinet door. Like, and then we also know on top of that, for those who have, suffered COVID and the impacts of COVID, we know it's doing things to the brain and adding to the fogginess and fragmentation. So it's just frustrating to not be able to access language, to not be able to have like a clear sense of time and memory of things, to be able to hold. I was talking to a colleague the other day and she got something confused and she was like, that's what I get for trying to just hold something in my brain and not looking at a piece of paper. And it's hard when you still have memory of being able to really hold a lot together in your mind and in your brain. But you find yourself in a season where it's like, nope, things definitely just disappear. And if I don't have it in front of me, like I'm maybe not going to remember. And again, this may not be everyone's experience, but when there's been massive disruption that impacts the brain in all the ways you talked about, and sometimes you certainly experience it in the moment, but it can be something that lingers, which is why you have language like a post-traumatic stress.
Yes.
Often you start to notice it the most when you're not in as much pervasive trauma in the moment. It's when all of a sudden the dust starts to settle a little bit, but you can't quite get back to what was before.
Yes. And the fact that I know at least a little bit about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the mesolimbic prefrontal cortex, where we hold space and time, particularly. Again, there are other portions of the brain that hold that. It doesn't help. It just doesn't help because I have recollection enough of how I at least think I used to function. And the disparity between what was and what is creates, again, not only this sense of haze, but distortion. So like as a mariner, sailor, particularly in Puget Sound, when thick fog comes, you don't know where sound's coming from. You think it's coming from your bow, but actually the fact is it's coming from behind you, the stern. So I think with all that sense of haze and fog of forgetfulness, I'm much more like I'm just not able to do what I used to do. And I feel the sense of distortion around me. So even a question like, do you remember when, becomes something I actually feel panic when somebody begins to ask me that, because I'm already aware that for the most part, that particular part of my prefrontal cortex ain't doing great. So when we begin to talk about post-traumatic stress, one can assume fragmentation will show itself in very different ways. I'm just giving one category, what I'm calling the graying, the fogging, the haze, the distortion, that opens up a second huge category. That's the sense of numbness, where indeed what is called our vagal system that runs, it's really the nerve highway from our brain, particularly our reptilian or ancient brain, all the way down through to our stomach and our viscera. And that's where so often I'll just feel like I can feel in my stomach something's not well. And it's not indigestion. It isn't I eat too much. It's just that my stomach is not well. And the only, in one sense, response when things are already foggy is I just shut down. Right. And it's another way of saying the vagal system is very directly related to our capacity to dissociate. And dissociation is not disassociation, which is like leaving a club, but dissociation is that disconnection from a reality that we find intolerable, that somehow there is either too much or too little cortisol, too much or too little capacity to engage. And that's one of the things that's crucial to understand about post-traumatic stress, is that though there is a numbing, there's also a heightened level of capacity to, in some sense, feel the intrusion of strong emotion or images.
Right.
In other words, the right hemisphere still is operating bringing a whole lot of debris that shows up particularly with regard to our dream life or just when we're functioning on a day-to-day basis. We were just in a meeting, the two of us, conversations occurred, and literally I had flashes of events that were almost a year or more ago. Yeah. And I don't know if you noticed on the screen, but I was like,
yes, I did notice.
I was trying to keep some level of regulation and not go, I think I just need to go off screen and scream. But so when I say numb, don't think it's just like I don't feel. It's a kind of numbness where I don't seem to have the capacity to engage and process and to feel what I feel in a way that bears at least some degree of regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I don't know if you saw, I just saw that, and honestly, I don't remember who was suggesting it, that all children 8 years and older get screened for anxiety. It's like, this is where we're in the realm of anxiety and depression. Again, that can sometimes be so biochemical because our bodies have been amping up and then they have to come down. So, when we see post-traumatic stress in this realm of numbing, it can be where sleep disorders manifest. Like either you have insomnia or you need to sleep all the time. It can be where depression and anxiety, all of a sudden, maybe you've never really struggled with that, but this is a way your body is trying to cope with all the dysregulation. This is where, we have language like burnout, but there's also medical terms like adrenal fatigue, where your adrenals just go, there's only so much cortisol I can flood for you. The mania was great while it lasted. It got you through. I mean, I think of every parent who had kids at home trying to get them through school for a year. There was a lot of mania and cortisol flooding involved to get us through that. And then it can be like a letdown where your adrenals just go, they are creating cortisol, but your capacity to regulate it, it's like a drain that goes so fast and you feel that sense of exhaustion and fatigue. And again, that grayness that can feel real close to depression, but sometimes is also your body's way of just being like, I've felt enough. Right. I don't want to feel anymore. Again, but what also you're saying, I definitely tend to much more towards anxiety. And, it's like, I actually know PTSD is manifested when all of a sudden I don't feel anxious and I can't be bothered to care. I'm like, oh, okay. We ran out of the trauma fear. And now we're in the realm of like, whoa, what just happened? How do I recover? And it's really, we're talking about painful things. And I also, when you're bringing the brain into it, it's that reality of like, and these are not things that discriminate. Like, oh, some people are just much more resilient. I do think resiliency, resource, community care, not having to bear levels of oppression certainly help people have a different kind of resilience to bear trauma. So I don't think it impacts us all equitably. Unfortunately, I think that's part of the wickedness of living in a world that evil still exists, but I still don't think anyone gets to escape some of the impact of this level of stress on our bodies.
So again, let's see if we can just not so much get it under management and control, but numbness does not mean you're not going to have something of this intersection between despair, depression, and irritability and anxiety. There is this fluctuation, but where we come back to the word numbness is there's just this internal, I don't have it. I don't have the ability to manage my anger or irritability or my anxiety. And it's just, in some sense, almost better for the universe, let alone the people I'm in relationship with and me, if I just don't care. I just don't want to do any more than what I absolutely, at the most basic biological level, need to do in order to survive. And that sense of, I don't have the ability to process context. And I go back to the thalamus, the integrating work of our brain has to, in one sense, see the event in a larger context. And without context, there isn't meaning. And without meaning, we don't have a sense of purpose or capacity to hold the complexity of what's happening around us. So when we lose the ability to have time and context, we're pretty much like without a rudder in some tumultuous seas. Mm-hmm. And that kind of, I'm going to go down. I'm going to hope my boat doesn't flip over, but I'm just going to hope that things just don't get worse. Mm-hmm. That's where so often in my own depletion, lack of reserve, lack of ability, I quit, but here's the complication. Life doesn't, and trauma doesn't.
And we haven't also named that sometimes in order to quit, you actually have to turn to addictions, right? Like you actually have to turn to things that help take you out, that help build a little bit of a barrier. So you're absolutely right.
Is there something you want to say to me?
No, I was mostly thinking about myself. So I was just thinking about, I'm so aware for so many of us, just where there might be places that maybe we haven't dealt with in a long time, or we've experienced a lot of freedom from, that are making their way back as something we'd gravitate towards, and where we can so easily turn against ourselves. And I'm not saying, but it's okay. I'm more saying, can there be a little mercy to understand there's something your body needs? There's something you need. There is like some reprieve you're needing. Now turning to addictions is not actually going to give you what you need. We know it actually just reinforces it and makes it worse, and then you need more. Just that sense of like, sometimes we have to acknowledge, oh, this is what's at play. You know, I'm in some post-traumatic stress. Yes, it's very real.
The biochemical process of stress has the capacity to be disrupted momentarily by an infusion of dopamine. And we know dopamine is the biochemical of pleasure. So if you were to, like, I thought you were going to be asking, like, how's your drinking? How's your sugar? And you know what? I don't know how it took so long for me. I don't know how I got on Instagram to begin with, but do you know this thing called Reels?
Yeah.
Like there are people who are like playing tennis with incredible shots. And then there are people who are dancing. And then there are people who are snowboarding. And like, I probably thought I was on one of those reels for maybe 10 minutes. Becky took a snapshot of me because she knew I would deny. And I was on for a full hour before she brought it back and said, how long have you been looking at your Instagram reels? I said, I don't know, it's 5 or 10 minutes. She goes, look at this. I took a photo of you. And like she knows she needs data. She needs prima facie data, because I'm going to work my language system to deny and attempt to bully her into a distortion of her own sense of time. Nonetheless, when she showed it to me, it's like, yeah, I was on for a full freaking hour. And I couldn't even tell you, other than tennis, snowboard, motorcycle racing, what was on there, but nothing. So the addictive process is another form of chemical or guided dissociation, which is why people end up drinking or using pornography. Again, not excusing it, but simply saying it's an effort to deal with post-trauma stress to lower. But what we know is, at least with regard to sugar and alcohol, candy, et cetera, is it creates inflammation. And in that, our bodies are actually being diseased by our own efforts to, in one sense, numb but create pleasure, which works not so well.
Well, and it's so very fleeting. And that's like I saw this video of a little toddler who was eating pizza, and I thought, this is the exact articulation of the impact of dopamine. And it was like the toddler was crying because she was like, I want more, but my body's saying no. It's like that desire, like you don't want the dopamine to stop. So you want one more bite, but also you're so full, and you know the pleasure. It's really the grief of the loss of that pleasure. I just was like, oh, I feel that in my bones, little one. So,
well, if it's a reel, send it to me. I don't think you can actually send reels, but nonetheless. So a third factor is isolation. So as we've talked about fragmentation, but asking you all to go, don't think about it as like this huge breakdown. Think far more about the graying and the fogging, not only of memory, but of a sense of how you see and how easy it is to misinterpret, to distort, to not hold reality well. And then a numbing. But seen in these jagged edges of irritability and anxiety, and then some degree of shutting down. A third issue is, again, isolation. And that isolation is closer to, I'm not just overwhelmed, but at some level, I feel at fault. I feel blameworthy. And this is crucial to understanding, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder. There's always, with post-traumatic stress, a sense of fragmentation, and in the exhaustion, a kind of powerlessness. But when we get to this third category, it's where there is self-blame for good reason or for perceived and inaccurate. But that kind of comparison of, I used to be able to do this. What the heck is wrong with me? So the internal isolation, like I'm shutting down with others. And I just don't want, in some sense, the complication of more failure, more relational tension, more requirement for engagement. And in that isolation, there is, I mean, again, this is so heartbreaking to say, evil is so effective. Divide, conquer. To the degree you are divided from the people who can care most for you, who can honor your own struggle, be attuned and help you contain, be able to work towards some degree of repair, to the degree you isolate, you are literally cutting yourself off from the resources you need in order for a healing process, even if it is a lengthy process, to actually occur. Isolation is a big issue, and I see it particularly with regard to how apt I am. I mean, I don't carry a gun. I don't own a gun, but there have been moments with road rage. I'm just grateful that I've not been arrested. Shouting because somebody cut in line. Where isolation shows itself, I'm putting words to, is a level of blame shifting, a scapegoating, a kind of an indulgence of rage because it feels like it's restoring a level of energy and power and giving me what I once had, even if it is deeply ungodly and really deeply irrational.
Well, and I mean, I'm sorry, you don't have to travel too far out. Well, I live in Philadelphia, so maybe it's different for me, but you don't have to travel too far outside your door to just feel, you can feel that rage and isolation just in the air right now. You know, it's like, I try to move. I mean, I have it in myself and I'll be like, wow, I got there real quick. That contempt, right? Like whether it's self-contemptuous or other contemptuous, but how quick we can move to rage right now in this season. And it feels so volatile. Like it is a really volatile time. And that's not just because people are just angrier, which I mean, they are, but it's coming out of traumatic stress and a response to traumatic stress. And in some ways, it's almost like what we feel is we need it. Like you just said, we need it in order to feel any sense of volition or like survival. And we feel entitled to it. Again, that gives it probably sometimes more will and intention than I think sometimes is happening with post-traumatic stress. It's like, you know, this would be the realm where we see this a lot with war veterans and PTSD, where there's just outbursts of violence and anger that is maybe doesn't actually line up with who they are and how they've known themselves to be. And it can feel really scary. And, it takes us back, I think, to those like toddler spaces when like toddlers are feeling intense, extreme emotions and they're having a breakdown. And you can see both the rage and the terror in their little bodies. Like, I feel out of control. I just responded in a way that is not like, how did I get so angry so quick about something? And maybe for some, the isolation doesn't lead to anger, but leads to more of again, that more back to that like shutting down, that, incapacity to actually lean back into community and rhythms that have been really important to you. And it makes sense when we've been in a kind of trauma that has disrupted community rhythms and has made them feel, we're afraid. Like in some ways there's been threat to being around a lot of people, and not mostly just because of disease and trying not to spread a virus. But I think, we're now experiencing there's an intensity in our social interactions, in our relationships, in our emotional world.
Well, I would say I am seeing, particularly with the people I have the privilege of working with as a therapist, a kind of virulent season of contempt. And that, when I say, blame shifting, sometimes the blame shifting is to some perceived part of me that I assault as the cause of my current malaise or struggle in my marriage or friendship or parenting. Like I am so deeply aware of the kind of assault that many parents are experiencing against themselves for their actual and or perceived or intersecting failures. And to be able to bring a kindness, a mercy, could we slow down here? The contempt for oneself shifts pretty rapidly. Like, you don't get it. I mean, I had a client just nearly bite my head off with you don't get it. Do you understand how severe things are right now with my, and I'm not trying to role play beyond, the kind of intensity was much greater than what I'm vocalizing. So the rage is often directed toward oneself or younger parts of oneself or idealized parts of yourself that aren't doing what you think you should be able to do in this current moment. And that kind of volatility, of violence, of assault, again, we're seeing levels of tragic, multiple shootings that feel virtually like it's every day. Some mall, some party, some event, some subway. And I don't intend to be either discouraging or naive, but if we're in a period of post-traumatic stress, and I want to underscore such a brilliant point you made, where you begin to see the effects of post-traumatic stress is not when you're in the thick of it, but when there is some degree of amelioration. And as the severity begins to lessen, it's as if the body is able to say, okay,
this is what we've suffered.
Now you need to begin to tend to this fogging, to this exhaustion and irritability, and even more so to this kind of violence against self or perceived others that have done you harm. So we are in a season where, at some level, even if things keep getting so-called better with regard to the pandemic, I don't think we're out of it by any stretch, personally. But even if we're tapering, the fact is, in the tapering, we've got to have an awareness that the people around us are going to begin to feel even more some of the effects of these realities.
And it can feel almost despairing for us to talk. Like I feel in myself like, oh no, we're moving toward despair. But I think what it can also do, and where we will move, is it can also help us know how to tend, how to be creative together, and how to understand, how to have more context and understanding as to what is actually at play. Whether that's, again, playing out in our church community, in our families, in our schools, in multiple places. I think anytime you have more awareness, it doesn't drastically change things, but it certainly gives you more choice as how you want to live and move and breathe in the midst of that, and what kind of tools and skills and resources are needed to tend. And I don't know if there's a way to, like, this is an overwhelming time. This is an overwhelming time for teachers, an overwhelming time for nurses and doctors and medical professionals, an overwhelming time for parents and ministers and therapists, and marriages and just all the places where we're so human. And so there has to be mercy for that, but we're not bound to despair, and we're not bound to futility. But it will take, as we know, healing takes intentionality. It takes tending. It takes time. And it does take disrupting patterns. And so there is hope, there is possibility, and there is healing. And I think it can be hard when, in some ways, like what you're saying is, we're not like, there's going to be more trauma. There's going to be more places where our bodies feel under threat. And so we also are learning to heal and to mend and to cope when there might be ongoing realities.
Well, let me go back to the phrase that you created, human-sized. To become human-sized means that, to some degree, we have to understand that our humanity is not fundamentally bound to trauma, but trauma has to be human-sized in order for us to begin a process of seeing change. Again, I'm not sure trauma is going to be better, but certainly the reality of post-traumatic stress is going to be even more clearly something that we have to tend to as helpers, as people who need to put the oxygen mask on first in order to help whomever is sitting next to us. In this case, I always want my wife to put the mask on me first. But nonetheless, the reality is we need to put our mask on in order to be able to put the mask on those we're with. And that's what we'll address in a lovely week.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.